They stepped off the train with eyes hollowed by war, their coats threadbare, their stomachs gnawing at emptiness. The night air of America carried a scent they had not breathed in years: warm bread, roasted meat, the faint tang of apples sweetened by sugar. For the German women in uniform, prisoners of a lost empire, every step across the gravel into the camp felt like walking deeper into enemy territory. They braced for punishment, for revenge, for the lean cruelty their own government had promised them would be their fate. Instead, what awaited was a hall lit by yellow bulbs, alive with clatter and steam, where soldiers in white aprons balanced trays heavy with food. The shock began not in the eyes but in the nose. The fragrance of roast beef drifted toward them, mingled with the butter-soft aroma of mashed potatoes, gravy thick as velvet, bread with crusts that crackled when broken. These women had grown used to a different perfume: the sour odor of turnip soup, the scorched bitterness of ersatz coffee, the stale dampness of moldy flour. In Germany, ration cards measured existence in ounces. Here, plates brimmed as if war itself had been forgotten. Some prisoners blinked hard, convinced it was a cruel trick, that the sweetness of apple pie cooling on counters was meant only for American eyes. For months they had been told they were the monsters of the Reich, and monsters were not fed with kindness. Yet the line of women shuffled forward, metal trays pressed into their hands by cooks who did not sneer or curse. Instead, the Americans spoke briskly, like men accustomed to serving factory workers or farmhands rather than the enemy. "Roast beef tonight. Don't spill the gravy," one quipped, his voice carrying a casual warmth that disarmed more than any rifle. A few of the women dared a glance upward, as if expecting to be struck. None was. The only blows came from the pungent waves of cinnamon rising off pie slices golden as autumn leaves. Hunger wrestled with suspicion. Many of these women had served as auxiliaries, nurses, clerks, roles that tied them to the machinery of war but not to its most violent gears. Still, they had endured the firestorms of Hamburg and Dresden, the slow starvation that shrank cheeks and thinned wrists. Their last memories of home were cellars filled with ash and silence, meals measured in watery ladles. Now, across the ocean, their first night in captivity offered meat so tender it fell apart at the touch of a fork. One prisoner later recalled, almost whispering, "We thought they would starve us. Instead, they gave us beef." The irony cut deep. Nazi propaganda had painted America as a land of decadence, greedy and soft, incapable of sacrifice. Yet here was proof of something else: an empire of abundance, able to feed not only its soldiers but also the very prisoners captured from battlefields. It was not cruelty that humbled them but generosity. Each slice of beef carried more weight than any speech. Each spoonful of mashed potatoes spoke of power that needed no explanation. And then there was the pie. Apple pie, a dish so ordinary to Americans that it barely warranted mention, yet to women whose diets had shrunk to crusts and turnips it looked like treasure under glass. The crust crumbled like sugared sand, the filling burst with cinnamon and butter, a taste of orchards untouched by bombs. One young auxiliary, no more than 20, stared at her plate as though it were a painting in a museum. Her lips trembled when she lifted the first forkful. To eat it was to admit something: that the war was lost not simply in trenches or skies, but in kitchens, in the quiet victory of wheat fields unscarred by fire. Silence filled the mess hall, broken only by clinking cutlery and the soft sighs of women remembering what fullness felt like. Some ate quickly, devouring the feast as if it might vanish. Others hesitated, nibbling slowly, suspicious that kindness could carry a hidden blade. The guards watched with casual indifference, chatting among themselves. They seemed amused, perhaps, at the sight of hardened soldiers' wives and auxiliaries astonished by mashed potatoes. For the Americans, it was Tuesday supper. For the Germans, it was the collapse of 1,000 lies served on porcelain plates. Numbers haunted the room. In Europe, civilians scraped by on rations as low as 800 calories a day. Here, the meal before them easily topped 3,000. It was not just food. It was arithmetic, proof of a nation whose factories, farms, and ships could outproduce an entire continent. To those women, each bite was a revelation dressed in gravy. The war had been decided long before their capture, and now they tasted the reason why. Yet amid astonishment flickered something softer. One nurse, her fingers rough from tending the wounded, whispered to the woman beside her, "This tastes like peace." Another murmured a prayer she had not spoken since the bombs fell on Cologne. The meal thawed something inside them, though whether it was gratitude or grief, none could quite name. Some eyes brimmed, not from sorrow but from the shock of remembering joy. Of course, not all were moved. A few scowled into their trays, determined to resist even flavor. They chewed defiantly, as if to prove that no pie could change their hearts. But the effort rang hollow. Sweetness clings, whether welcome or not. Even bitterness has trouble surviving against butter and cinnamon. As trays emptied and bellies filled, a quiet unease lingered. What did it mean, this generosity? Was it mercy, propaganda, or simply habit? Could a slice of pie carry the weight of politics? The women could not know. But they felt, deep in their bones, that something larger than hunger was being satisfied. The enemy had revealed not brutality, but abundance, and that abundance was more terrifying than any weapon they had yet seen. The lights buzzed overhead, plates scraped clean, guards gestured for them to rise. They stood slowly, stomachs heavy, spirits unsteady. For months they had carried images of America drawn in the dark strokes of propaganda. Tonight those images cracked beneath the glow of gravy boats and sugared crusts. Outside, night pressed cold against the camp, but inside their memories something far stranger had begun to take root. They had come expecting punishment, but what they received was a banquet. And though they would not admit it aloud, many of them knew, the real shock had only just begun. Morning broke across the camp with a pale, forgiving light, and the women awoke to the strange sensation of not being hungry. 4 years, hunger had been their shadow, constant, gnawing, a dull ache that colored every thought. Now, with bellies still heavy from roast beef and pie, they sat in their bunks blinking against the unfamiliar weight of fullness. Some whispered that it must have been a ruse, that today the real punishment would begin. Others clung stubbornly to the memory of cinnamon and butter, unwilling to surrender it to suspicion. The Americans, meanwhile, carried on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Guards in pressed uniforms strolled casually, speaking with easy laughter. Their indifference was almost insulting, as though the act of feeding prisoners lavishly was so routine it did not merit acknowledgement. That indifference was its own kind of statement. Abundance so secure it could afford to be generous, wealth so vast it could turn even enemies into dinner guests of necessity. For the German women, raised under years of speeches that painted America as corrupt and crumbling, this quiet display unsettled them more than jeers ever could. One nurse, Elsa, 30 years old with lines carved by exhaustion, found herself staring at the horizon. She had served in makeshift hospitals where morphine was gone by midday and the air reeked of gangrene. She remembered holding a dying boy's hand, promising food he would never taste again. Yet here, in a land unscarred by air raids, she smelled bacon drifting from the kitchens. Her thoughts tangled in knots of bitterness and longing. To be cared for by the enemy was a humiliation. To be fed so well by them was a betrayal of her own suffering. Still, her body responded to the scent with an involuntary growl. The conflict was not only external, between prisoners and captors, but within each prisoner herself. Pride clashed with need, ideology with appetite. They had been taught to see Americans as decadent, weak, addicted to luxuries. And yet those supposed luxuries, milk, sugar, meat, were here in endless supply, while in Germany they had become distant dreams. To admit the truth of what they saw was to confess that their homeland, the Reich that promised 1,000 years of power, had been reduced to crumbs and ashes. By midday, they were marched to work details, though the tasks were hardly punishing. Some sorted laundry, others peeled potatoes, a few carried wood. The guards joked that the women worked slower than their own sisters back home, though without cruelty in their tone. What struck the prisoners most was not harshness, but routine. Here, war seemed less like a catastrophe and more like an inconvenience barely touching daily life. Trucks rumbled in and out delivering supplies, soldiers passed with cups of coffee steaming in their hands, and the women realized they were watching a society untouched by the despair that had swallowed Europe. At supper, the disbelief deepened. Chicken roasted golden, peas glistening with butter, bread baked that very afternoon. A 19-year-old auxiliary, Marta, once proud in her crisp Luftwaffe uniform, now ragged at the hem, felt her will falter. She had sworn never to be softened by captivity, but when she tore into the bread, still warm, she closed her eyes in near prayer. A fragment of her childhood returned, her grandmother's kitchen before bombs had blackened the town, before ration lines had stretched around corners. For one fleeting moment, she forgot the defeat, forgot the humiliation, and remembered what it meant to be human. Some of the women muttered that this was calculated cruelty, a deliberate kindness designed to shame them. Perhaps it was. If so, it worked with ruthless efficiency. Propaganda could not compete with steaming plates and the hum of refrigerators stocked to excess. The battlefield had shifted from mud and blood to tables and kitchens, where America's true strength was laid bare in calories and comfort. Even those determined to resist could not help noticing the contrast. Back home, mothers bartered wedding rings for a sack of potatoes. Here, guards tossed away crusts without a second thought. Elsa, who had once stitched wounds under candlelight, found herself breaking down in the mess hall. She pressed her napkin to her mouth as tears came unbidden. To her, the food was more than nourishment, it was an indictment. Every bite reminded her of what Germany could not provide, of the boys she had promised to save but lost. Across the table, Marta reached to touch her hand, but Elsa pulled away. Pride demanded distance. Yet in her silence, her wet eyes betrayed the truth. Kindness wounded deeper than cruelty. The Americans noticed, though they said little. One officer, walking past the tables, remarked dryly to a fellow guard, "You'd think we were running a hotel." The guard chuckled, shaking his head. The prisoners stiffened at the words, unsure if the laughter mocked them or simply the absurdity of the situation. But there was no malice in the men's eyes, only a kind of baffled tolerance, as if they themselves found it strange to be caretakers of women who once served the Reich. Night settled, and the women lay awake in their bunks. For the first time in years, hunger did not gnaw at their ribs, yet sleep refused to come easily. Their bodies were satisfied, but their minds wrestled with a new unease. If the enemy could feed them so well, what else could they do? If the enemy's land overflowed with abundance, what did that mean for Germany's future? The questions pressed heavy, though none dared voice them aloud. To admit wonder was to admit defeat. Still, in the silence of that night, one truth clung like the scent of cinnamon on their hands. The war was no longer just about weapons. It was about whose world could offer more to live for. And as the camp settled into quiet, the women realized that the greatest blow had not been struck on battlefields, but across dining tables. The real war was not just ending, it was being rewritten, and tomorrow, the reckoning would continue. Which city are you watching our video from? For more powerful stories from World War II, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.